Dave Talks Comics, Episode 75, the 75-cent era. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. I talk from my notes. I don't go panel by panel or scene by scene. I try to do more than just summarize the stories. This program is not spoiler-free. I try not to spoil everything, but in the process of talking about these comic books and cartoons, I will probably spoil them in some way. On this episode of Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about the 75-cent era at DC and Marvel, and I will be talking about a few comic books I read, Samurai Jack and Tarzan, and a few podcasts I listened to. The 75-cent era at DC Comics began in December of 1983. Prior to 75 cents, DC Comics had been 60 cents. I remember some of the issues that came out then, and I know that I bought them at the time. Specifically, I remember All-Star Squadron number 28, which was part 2 of a story involving Dr. Fate and the Spectre. Well, they played the big roles in that story, and it was kind of a battle between them because there was another guy named Kulak or something like that who had cast some sort of a spell on the Spectre, and so Dr. Fate was trying to free him, and then of course the All-Star Squadron, or maybe it's just the Justice Society. I think it was more like the Justice Society get involved, and actually that's part of the story. The next time that I talk about All-Star Squadron, that's one of the stories I want to talk about. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. The other story that I remember from this period, that I remember buying at that time, was a crossover from Batman and the Outsiders and New Teen Titans. It was Batman and the Outsiders number 5 and New Teen Titans number 37. Now it's funny because I do remember the price changing on All-Star Squadron, and maybe that's because I was buying it all along. I don't remember as clearly the price changing on Batman and the Outsiders and New Teen Titans, or I don't have a recollection of that. But that's another good story, and it's got these two covers that come together to form one cover. And I believe that has been reprinted in a couple places. I think in one of the New Teen Titans omnibuses, and also I think in that showcase edition of Batman and the Outsiders that was printed. I don't own either of those, but I do own the original issues, although I haven't read them in a long time. But my recollection is a really cool story where the two teams team up to battle the Fearsome Five, who were originally, I think, just New Teen Titan villains. And these are like Warp and Hoonigan, is that I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced. And who was the other? Oh, Plasmus. And then there was a woman, Phobia, and I guess there should have been, and Dr. Light, I think, was the other member of that team. Yeah, I believe that was the 5. Although that name, the Fearsome 5, it kind of makes me think of the Fatal 5, who are villains who battled the Legion of Superheroes in the 30th, and I guess also the 31st century at this point. Okay, so I goofed on the Fatal 5, the Fearsome 5. The team members that I named weren't the team members, with one exception. Dr. Light was a member of the Fearsome 5. The other 4 were not. The other 4 were all members of the Brotherhood of Evil, or the second incarnation of the Brotherhood of Evil, who did fight the New Teen Titans in at least a couple New Teen Titans stories. In issues 14 and 15 and 28 to 31 maybe. I'm looking at Wikipedia right now, so, buyer beware or something. I don't know. But what the people who were on I'm clicking back, here we go. The Fearsome Five, in addition to Dr. Light, were Gizmo, Shimmer, Mammoth, and Simon. And Simon showed up in the first season of, I think he's the only one of those. Yeah, he showed up in the first season of Young Justice, looking a little different. He was also in Crisis on Infinite Earths early on, although then I think he kind of vanishes from the story. So, yeah, I kind of goofed there. I had in my head the members of the Brotherhood of Evil, and instead we're talking about the Fearsome Five. I should have looked at the comic book before I started recording, and it wasn't until I went back and listened to what I recorded and at the same time was looking at the covers that I realized the mistake I made. The only other comic from DC from that month, and that's where these comics are coming from. I'm not talking about comics across this 75-cent era at DC. I'm talking about comics specifically from that first month where they jumped to 75 cents, is Sword of the Atom #4, and I don't think that I bought that at that time. I believe I bought that 5-6 years later, something like that. I think I picked up all of those Sword of the Atom issues, and this was a mini-series at that point. This was the initial Sword of the Atom mini-series where the atom shrunk down. I can't remember exactly what it was that made him decide to want to run off, but he winds up in the Amazon and discovers this tribe of tiny people, and he's living there for a time, and eventually he comes back. And this, of course, is Ray Palmer, the Ray Palmer atom, the atom of Earth 1. One thing I did find is that as far as DC Comics go, the Canadian price, because at that time, Canadian dollar was worth less than the U.S. dollar. The Canadian price was already 75 cents, and when the U.S. prices went to 75 cents, the Canadian prices went to 95 cents. And I think the Canadian price went up to 75 cents somewhere around like 1981, I think, but I didn't spend too much time trying to track that down. It was a little difficult doing this research. I used Comic Book DB, and I used the Grand Comics database to help me do this, but there is no easy way to search. And the best way I found to search was using the Grand Comics database, but even there, the problem would be that the comic would be listed at several different prices. Like they'd have the price in U.S. dollars, in Canadian dollars, in British pounds, and sometimes in other currencies. So you could say, look for 75 cents, and it would turn up comics that had the 75 cents Canadian on them, and you couldn't specify which currency. So it took a little bit of work and a little bit of scrolling through various pages and clicking on comics to see, is that the British price, is that the Canadian price, or is it the U.S. price? And so it began at DC Comics in December of '83, and it ran, well, it's kind of difficult. That there really is no definite end to the 75-cent era. It's kind of over a period of time because there was some new series that would come out that DC would start at $1 an issue, while most of its comics were still at 75 cents an issue. And then there were some comics that it held onto at 75 cents an issue for a while. So what I was able to find was that, Who's Who, the definitive directory of the DC universe, was, I think, always $1 an issue, but that wasn't an ongoing. That was 26 issues in total. But the first ongoing to be $1 an issue, to not be 75 cents, was the Spectre series that started in April 1987, which I believe was written by Doug Munch, and I can't remember who did the art, and I didn't write that down. The first ongoing that changed from 60 cents, in other words, not a new ongoing, but a continuing ongoing, was Swamp Thing. And Swamp Thing number 60 in May of 87 was the last 75-cent issue. So 61 would have been the first. In June of 87 would have been the first of the dollar issues. And at that point, Swamp Thing was not Vertigo. It just said mature readers only. It still had the DC bullet only, the DC bullet on it, but it said mature readers only. And there would be various other books that would get transitioned over over the next 2-3 years, from mid '87 through the end of 1990. It looked, from what I could find, it looked like Batman and Superman were the last two books. Well, Batman transitioned over about 6 months before Superman did, around mid-1990. And then in December of 90 it looks like the end of the 75-cent era, as Superman's 3 titles at that time, Action Comics, Superman, and Adventures of Superman, that was the last time they were 75 cents, and then starting in January of 91, they went up to $1. Now, Marvel Comics is a little different, and it's a little interesting. Marvel Comics held on to the 60-cent price a little longer, and it didn't jump from 60 cents to 75 cents. In April of 85, Marvel Comics went into, and actually, April of 85, for about a year, it went into the 65-cent issue era. All their comics became 65 cents. And I have a vague recollection of that. So from April of 85 through March of 86, Marvel Comics were 65 cents, although most of the superhero books, by February, most of the superhero books became 75 cents starting in February of 86. And there was a few other books, more kid-friendly books, things like Ewoks and Strawberry Shortcake, and maybe, were they publishing the Muppet Babies back then? I'm not sure. Something like that. But those books stayed at the 65-cent price for a couple months longer, for like February and March of 86, and then by April of 86, they also transitioned over to the 75-cent era. So as far as the superhero books go, and really as far as Marvel Comics go, the 75-cent era at Marvel began in February of 86. I looked through the issues that came out that month, and honestly, I wasn't really reading much in the way of... I really wasn't reading any Marvel Comics at that point. I mean, none of them rang any bells. The most significant issue I could find, and it's not one that I read, was Rom number 75, Rom the Space Knight. And Rom's a book that I've never read any of Rom. He may have shown up in something that I've read, I'm not sure. But this was the final issue of Rom. So issue number 75 was 75 cents, and it was also the final issue of the series. One thing that I did discover when I was researching this on Marvel is that G.I. Joe the G.I. Joe comic never entered the 65-cent era. It was originally 60 cents, although I think the first issue was $1.50. But for the most part, the issues were 65 cents, and I didn't write down what the issue number was, but instead of going to, were 60 cents, but then instead of going to 65 cents, it went to 75 cents. And then also it went to $1 before the other Marvel series did. So the 75-cent era at Marvel Comics lasted basically from February of 86 to August of 89. That was the last month that most of the superhero books were 75 cents each, and then in September of 89 they went to $1 each, with the exception, of course, well, there was a few mini-series and things like that. The big exception... wait, I'm getting my wires crossed here, or am I? The 75 cent, you know what, I didn't write this down, but I'm remembering something. The 75-cent era, one of the events that was happening when that began was Secret Wars 2, which is a series that I've heard all kinds of things about. I've never been inspired to read it. I wasn't reading Marvel Comics at the time. And so Secret Wars, from what I could find, was always $1, was always 75 cents, even though most other Marvel comics were 65 cents at the time that Secret Wars began. So the 75-cent era at Marvel started later and ended earlier. It ended in September of '89, although some of the DC comics at that point had gone over to $1. And basically that's it for this is my first time I've done this, a number themed feature on Dave Talks Comics. People have done before things like they do their 75th episode, so they do issues number 75, or 100th episode, issues number 100, notable issues. Well, I just got this idea in my head this morning, and so I started to do some research, and this is what I came up with. I've been reading Exterminators, Volume 3, and Exterminators is a Vertigo series from the mid-2000s, I guess about 10 years ago, which is about the main character's name is Henry James, and he is an ex-con who is working for his father-in-law, or not his father-in-law, I keep saying that, for his stepfather, I guess, his mother's second husband. I believe his father is dead, and his stepfather has an extermination business called Bug Be Gone, and so he's working for that. Now, this comic book is really gross. It's definitely not for everybody. I honestly don't like this stuff a whole lot in general. I certainly wouldn't watch a movie like this, but for some reason I can deal with it in a comic book. It's kind of like I like horror comics, but I don't like horror films that much. I can't really explain it. I think it has something to do with me being able to control the pacing. But there is some really gross stuff in here when it comes to them fighting rats, birds, insects, spiders, frogs. I mean, it's really the way they deal with these things, the way these things get killed, it is really gross. So unless you got a strong stomach, I'm not sure if I could really recommend it. Now, this volume has 2 stories in it. It collects issues 11 through 16. The first story is called Brother, and it's about one of the supporting characters in the comic book, a guy named Saloth, who is Cambodian, came to the United States after or during the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian Civil War, I think it's called. When the Khmer Rouge took power, and then eventually they were overthrown. And basically what you learn in this is that there's more to him than was previously revealed. And that he wasn't just an innocent Cambodian, but he was actually somebody conducting experiments on people. Because that's kind of the role that's kind of one of his roles in this, at the Bug Be Gone company, is that he helps them to develop new ways to deal with with the pests that they have to deal with in their job. And this story was drawn, up to this point the series has been drawn by Tony Moore, but this particular story was drawn by Mike Hawthorne, whose art I like quite a bit. I wasn't really taken by it at first, but compared to the guy who drew most of the next arc, I think I really do like it a lot better. Now, the other arc that's in this collection was from issues 13 through 16. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in this. It doesn't really have one steady flow going through it, or at least I couldn't detect one steady flow. There's a number of things that happen. Henry's old cellmate returns, because like I said before, Henry is an ex-con. And that causes problems. He's not happy to see the guy. He's been having nightmares about the guy, or else, living in fear of when this guy's going to show up again. Nils, who is Henry's stepfather, he has a son who's in jail, and he shows up for the first time, although not too much happens with him. But I assume something's going to happen in the next collection, probably. Laura, who is Henry's ex-girlfriend, and works for a company named Okran, which makes pesticides. Seems to be fighting the good fight. She and Henry couldn't get along, but she seems to be fighting the good fight. It wasn't clear at first, but now it seems like she's trying to do more than it seemed like she was. I mean, it seemed like she was just an opportunist, just willing to work for whoever would pay her the most before. But now it seems like she's trying to do more, and she gets entangled between her boss and Henry's ex-cellmate. She gets entangled in there, and but she seems to be getting in over her head. So we'll see how that goes. But for the most part, those are some of the things that go on. There's also a couple of storylines that are kind of running in the background, and one of them involves Okran, and that's their development of this drug called Drax, or the Drax Project. And it looks like they're trying to use it on people who are in. It looks like one of these real estate things where they're trying to drive people out who are, by killing them, I think, with this pesticide called Drax. And the other story that you have kind of running in the background, or that had showed up before and that you're getting a little more of now, is there's this mystical box which had appeared either the first or the second arc. I'm not sure which it was. And you get a little bit more, a little tease really just, of something more about that, which I'm sure is going to show up in the next arc. So that's it for Exterminators. Now, the other thing I've done is that I have bought a Kindle Fire. I have a Kindle, which I use just to read books on, but that's, it's not color. So I bought a Kindle Fire, which is a 7-inch, so it's not huge. And it's very convenient for carrying around. I take it to work with me. I read it on the train and on the bus. And so I've only bought a couple comic books. I haven't signed up for any services like the Marvel Comics Unlimited or whatever it's called. And the first thing I bought was actually from Dark Horse, and it was something I've been eyeing, something that I wanted to read, and that is Tarzan by Joe Kubert, Volume 1. Now, the best way to describe this is that it is an homage to the Sunday one-pager from probably the 30s and maybe into the 40s and maybe even continuing beyond that. I'm not certain. But in the introduction, Joe Kubert, which I believe was written about 10 years ago, Joe Kubert talks about how he loved Hal Foster and Bern Hogarth's strips that they did for the Sunday paper for Tarzan. And it would be a full newspaper page. And so it would only be a weekly. So each week you would get a full page. It would be kind of like getting a full comic book page. Now, the only thing is that this book, the pages in these collections read like those pages. The only thing is that those pages the transitions from page to page aren't always great, I found. It's better if you read them each page individually and then kind of try to fill in your mind what might come in between, because it just doesn't, I don't know, there's something about it that doesn't, I wasn't enjoying it at first, and then I started to read them like that. And so if you read each one as kind of a separate piece, it's almost like reading a one-panel strip each day, where the panels don't, I mean, there is one story that goes through these issues, each of these issues. In fact, the first 4 chapters, and I've only read 5 out of 8 of these issues, the first 4 are one story, which is basically the origin of Tarzan, as told to Jane by somebody else. I'm not sure who it is. I'm not sure if it's that French guy who Tarzan rescues at one point, but the artwork is beautiful. It's a little weird reading it because because of the way it reads. In other words, it feels like he did a whole bunch of one-pagers, which altogether are one story, but when you read them all together at the same time, you don't have that break in between. And I kind of feel like I'm going on too long about this, so I'm going to move on. But the other thing I should mention is that the 5th chapter in this, and I believe that this is the only one, he actually did with Bern Hogarth, who was one of the artists that did these one-page Sunday strips. And I actually have, I'm not sure if I still do, but when I was younger, I had a puzzle, which was a Tarzan, which was of a Tarzan comic strip, one of those one-page strips. And it was, I don't know, 12, no, it was probably something like 2 by 3, 2 feet by 3 feet or something like that. I'm not sure exactly, or maybe 18 inches by 2. I'm not sure, but he did the last story that I've read so far, which is called Land of the Giants. He did with Bern Hogarth. So Hogarth drew most of it, but every once in a while there'll be a panel where you can tell, oh yeah, that's definitely Joe Kubert. So it was a little weird at first because I didn't know that Hogarth had drawn this issue, and I think they wrote it together as well. But so I'm looking forward to reading the rest of this collection. I'm not sure if I'm going to go on and read more because it's not blowing me away. Okay, so the other book that I bought on the Kindle, for the Kindle, is Samurai Jack, The Threads of Time. They had it on sale for half off. I think it was last weekend. And actually I bought the first 2 collections. Now, I love the Samurai Jack cartoon. I really do. I used to have it on DVD. I'm not sure what happened to it, though. I may have to... I was just looking at the Volume 3 collection and thinking of buying that again, of the cartoon. But the Threads of Time, basically, if you know anything... Well, Samurai Jack is somebody from the past, our past, who battles a demon, and he's about to defeat the demon, and so he throws the demon into... No, I'm sorry, the demon throws him into the future, where he has already won. The demon has won. And so now Jack is trying to get back to the past. And so basically almost every episode was about him learning about some way to get back to the past. And that's what this story is about. He learns about the threads of time, and if he can find all these threads and weave them together, then he can rewind his own timeline, he's told. And so I'm 4 chapters into this. So far, I like the individual moments, but which is kind of similar to what I'm experiencing with Tarzan, but I'm not crazy about the bigger picture. When I think about it as a whole, I'm not crazy about it, but I really do like the artwork, and I like some of the little moments. It's just some things seem to happen a little too conveniently. I guess part of what I really liked about the Samurai Jack cartoon is, part of it's the animation, it's the inventiveness of it, which you do get in this, and I in some places I feel it's a little lacking in that area. It just, some of the solutions seem a little too simple, or aren't really explained, and leave me kind of shaking my head. But I do like the art, and I like some of the little moments, and I like the idea behind it all, and I like that they're doing new stories, but they're kind of keeping with the spirit of the show. Unfortunately, so far, Aku, who's the demon that Jack fought in the past and now rules the world, hasn't shown up so far, but I think he's in the final chapter of this collection. And then I have bought the next collection. I can't remember what that's called, but I will be reading that as well. And hopefully I'll like that one a little more, or hopefully the ending of this one will give me a better appreciation for the story as a whole. The only other thing I want to say about the Kindle Fire is I noticed that Lazarus by Greg Rucka and Michael Lark is on sale in Comixology this weekend. That's the weekend of, this is June 6th and 7th, 2015. And I'm thinking about buying at least the first trade, which I believe they're all half off. The first 15 issues, I think, if I remember correctly. The only other thing I want to mention is that I have been listening to some podcasts. I'm always listening to podcasts, but I was listening to my Heroes Con episodes from last year when I went down to Charlotte, and I'm going down again in a couple weeks. In fact, 2 weeks from now is going to be Heroes Con. I've already arranged for a couple commissions. I will post pictures of those once I get them. I'm not going to say anything else other than that. I might arrange for a couple more. I don't know. But it's kind of neat listening to my road trip down. It's kind of neat for me, at least, listening to my road trip down and then my recap after the day and the things I remembered and the things I've forgotten now that I talk about then, which is one of the reasons why I like to do this podcast. And then I also listened to a podcast about Appleseed Con, which I went to 3 weeks ago. I think it was 3 weeks ago at this point. It was a podcast that I had not heard of before. I found out about it through a post on Twitter, which is the podcast is called Boku Pop, and it's episode 12. And it runs just over 2 hours long. Honestly, it's a bunch of guys. Well, it's not just guys. There's at least one woman there. It's a bunch of people who were showing at the con, creators, talking about they talk about the con, but they also get into talks about all kinds of other stuff too, like Mad Max and the portrayal of black people in comic books, and a number of them are black, African American. So it's a good discussion. I didn't listen to it all in one sitting. I kind of broke it up in at least 3 sittings. But I thought it was an interesting conversation. It was fun conversation, and they got good recording equipment, so it all comes in nice and clear. So it's definitely worth listening. I'm not sure if I'm going to add this podcast to the list of podcasts that I currently listen to on a regular basis, but I'll probably look into it, and I might check out another episode or two. And it's called Boku Pop, BEAUCOUP Pop, and it was episode 12, and it was just released like in the past week, 10 days, something like that. That's it for episode 75 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, at Dave Talks Comics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about some television programs. I'll be talking about a cartoon first, Young Justice. Then I'll be talking about a couple of non-cartoon shows, Arrow and Daredevil. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening. And I will be talking about a few comic books I read. Samurai Jack, Tarzan. Actually, that's it.